I'd like to introduce and welcome our presenters today, Charlotte Royer-Malvestuto with the Delaware Valley Node and Jack Chally with the Clinical Coordinating Center. Jack, I'll turn things over to you.
All right, thanks, Liz. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for what I think is a very interesting and exciting topic. Let me give you a little background about our presentation today. We had initially started talking about sort of the unexpected things that happen and events that occur during clinical research, and that sort of evolved into really thinking about, let's not just talk about these things, let's actually provide you tools and structure to try and mitigate or avoid these situations, and that's what led us to an introduction to risk management. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be presenting a brief overview of risk management. We're going to talk about, give you some very simple and straightforward tools to use in terms of understanding what your risks are and categorizing those risks in terms of impact and likelihood of occurrence, and then ultimately to try and figure out the risks that are most concerning or have potentially the most impact upon your research study, how you would mitigate those risks, whether you avoid those risks happening in the first place, or how you would control if those risks do occur, how would you control that situation or manage or mitigate that situation. As you can see on the training outline, we talked briefly about risk management, and then most importantly at the end, once we get through the slides, we're really going to open it up and ask you to bring forward scenarios or situations that we can talk about not only what happened, but use the risk management tools and really talk about were these situations that could have been avoided or mitigated by implementing this process. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Charlotte so she can talk about these concepts from more of a clinical research perspective.
Hi, everyone. This is Charlotte. Welcome to today's training. As Jack has described, risk management provides us with an important tool for managing research studies at our site. The model that we're introducing today provides a structure to a process that I suspect many of us already do all the time, just not in a structured way. When I first spoke with Liz about this topic, I was really excited because the strategies that we will be talking about can be applied to almost any situation. I think the model provides a useful process for resolving potential barriers to implementation of research, and it reduces or prevents undesirable impact on this study. What I really like is that it's based on the premise that identifying and addressing potential harms is a good thing, and ignoring or hiding problems is never helpful, and obviously in clinical research, it could be a big problem and a huge risk. So it's particularly true in what we do. Jack?
Great. If you notice on our next slide, gentleman being trampled by the lead element probably would have benefited if he and his group had considered risk management and tried to mitigate their risk before their live broadcast. Maybe they're dead broadcast at this point. It's hard to say. But again, moving forward, we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about what risk actually is. Risk is, the probability that some adverse circumstance will occur, some event or circumstance that may impact, for us specifically, clinical research or the proper conducting of the clinical research. Risk management as a whole is the process of identifying risk, categorizing that risk, and developing contingency plans to address risk as applicable. This can be done overall with the study as a whole, or this can be done individually by each study section, by each study site, by each group. There's value in doing it both ways. When it says assess the probability of occurrence, it talks about 80%. That's kind of a magical number with risk management. You can presume that anything that you think has an 80% chance of occurring will occur at some time during the project or during the study. And you want to try and develop a strategy or a contingency for each risk. Not for every risk you identify, there could be hundreds to thousands of them, but for each one that we'll use a tool later to sort of delineate these risks, and we'll determine which ones are major risks, moderate risks, minor risks, and then you'll make the determination which ones you really want to plan for and have contingencies for. Moving on to the next slide, this is sort of an overview of the risk management process. So again, as we talked about, the first thing to do is risk identification. My personal preference here is to get the whole team together and do a brainstorming session to talk through all the aspects of where the protocol might be at risk, where the site may be at risk. And this adds value in a lot of different ways. Everybody looks at the protocol differently. The CTP staff look at the protocol differently than the research staff. The RA looks at the protocol differently than the principal investigator would. Everybody's input is really valuable. Then after you have this list of risks, you analyze the risks themselves. What's the likelihood they're going to occur, and what's the potential impact? Then you plan on how to avoid or minimize these risks. And if you can't avoid or minimize these risks, how can you mitigate or minimize their impact upon the research or upon the study as a whole? The last point here is this is a living and breathing process. This is something you need to evaluate. The two definite time points where you want to look at risk management are before the trial starts. And then after the trial, you want to do a sort of lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work. But they also should be monitored or rethought about several times throughout the research study. It kind of depends. If you have a 5-year research study, maybe doing this quarterly makes sense. If you have a 5-month research study, maybe doing this weekly makes some sense. And now I'd like to turn it over to Charlotte, where she can talk about applying this process to clinical research studies.
Jack, I agree with your assessment. Risk does happen, and I hope that none of us end up in the situation that of the lady in the cartoon on the previous page. But despite our best planning and best procedures, the best training, clinical research is inherently risky. From site selection to data closeout, each procedure has its own risk. If you've had an opportunity in the past to practice risk management, perhaps you have already experienced the degree to which it can be helpful in identifying and prioritizing potential harms. I like the fact that it lets you think through the best approach to potential situations before they actually occur, and to plan for your best resources, to use your best resources available. We know that clinical trials are costly, and if they're not implemented well, they have significant implications for the safety and well-being of our participants and those who are hoping to benefit ultimately from the outcome of the trial. Looking at the risk management process, we can see how useful it could be in a research setting. Much like any other business, we would need to identify what are our critical processes to ensure success, and certainly some of those would be our informed consent process, data entry, study monitoring, and then to secure the goods and services that we need in order to promote safe, ethical research practices. Pardon me. And I would certainly consider some of those to be having well-trained staff, adequate personnel, and having the supplies that we need and equipment that we need to implement the study. Basically, as we walk through the process, what it is asking is what could go wrong in this enterprise that you're working on, and how likely is it that this event could happen? How serious are the potential consequences if it does? I like the fact that this model reinforces that it's not enough to just identify potential problems, but it requires us to be proactive in our planning in order to avoid or minimize potential harms. Assigning a level of risk enables us to prioritize our focus. Risk planning provides the staff with an immediate course of action, which can be monitored, adjusted, and fine-tuned as often as necessary.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I want to focus on one thing that Charlotte said real quickly in terms of this isn't a pessimistic process. This is a realistic process. Things are going to happen. There are risks, and risks will occur, and events will occur throughout each and every trial. And I think a hidden value here is by doing this up front, by establishing these lines of communications up front, we create a group environment or a culture of openness about talking about risks, and people won't be inclined to hide things or hide risks or hide bad situations that may be occurring or potentially could occur. And by opening those channels of communication, we hopefully will be ahead of even risks we didn't anticipate. Moving forward, we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of generating these lists of possible risks. One thing we really want to focus on here is the event itself, the risky event itself, not the outcome. If you look at our examples on the bottom of the page, there was a failure to meet a schedule. Some people would think that's the event. That's actually the outcome. In this circumstance, that failure to meet the schedule happened because of shipping delay. And what we can learn to try and mitigate or manage better is the shipping delays themselves. Also, when we're talking about, again, the clinic or the CTP or whatever work area opening late because of a snowstorm, the snowstorm is actually the event. And being able to try and manage or mitigate the snowstorm itself, or knowing when it's going to happen and working around that contingency, having contingencies to work around that, is what risk management is. It's not, oh, we opened late, now what do we do? It's trying to be proactive, as Charlotte alluded to earlier. And Charlotte, at this point, you want to talk a little bit more specifically about these sort of events and outcomes in the capacity of clinical research?
Yes. Thank you, Jack. When we talk about risky events or risk events in regards to clinical research, they really can be anything that impacts on our ability to successfully administer the trial. Like the toy on the stairs or the shipping delay, unanticipated events don't have to be extraordinary to have an impact on the study. There are many common events that we all deal with on a regular basis that have impact on the outcome of the study, such as transportation problems, childcare difficulties, illnesses, even when participants can't come in or staff can't come in due to the flu, a cold, incarceration. So there are many different events that we already work with that can be planned for ahead of time and hopefully reduce the impact, because these events could result in an outcome such as missed appointments, missed study windows, missing data, and even possibly affect the outcome of the study.
We're actually going to talk a little bit about a risk log, which is going to be the first tool. We've put in, as you can see here, some examples. The first one we want to talk about is staff turnover. And I want to talk to you in terms of, on CTN 32, which is a study I'm associated with as well, we had a situation where our counselors had received a great deal of training to specialize them for counseling in CTN 32. It wasn't sort of the general counseling that they were used to. It was a very focused and time-sensitive counseling model. And we had actually thought ahead that, hey, we'll have a master trainer at every site, and if we do have turnover, that master trainer will be able to train anybody who leaves at the site. So in this circumstance, what happened was we had a counselor and an RA leave a site at the same time. The outcome then was we did not have a counselor to do our intervention. As you can imagine, if you look at the bottom, there's sort of a scale of risk down there. This was a pretty moderate to major risk for us, and I would rate it as about a 4. And unfortunately, in the nature of the clinical trials that we do, staff turnover is pretty common. I would also rate that somewhere around a 4. And what ultimately happened in this circumstance was we sent someone who had been one of the counselor trainers at the investigators meeting to the site to help train the counselor, but we lost a couple weeks in that transition, and our master trainer, unfortunately, was so busy covering for the RA as well as doing their job as a site coordinator that they couldn't train the counselor, and we lost some time by sort of a contingency plan, but we didn't think it all the way through. We didn't have this formalized process. Charlotte, I know you had a situation with some issues with CTP buy-in on one of your studies.
Yes, we did. On CTN 28, we thought that we'd done a good job of presenting the study to the clinic, and we largely met with the clinic directors at the various sites and the owner of the company. But what happened was we had a very poor buy-in initially by our clinic staff, the intake staff and the counselors. The site was fee-for-service, And unfortunately, there was a misconception among the clinical team that referring patients to the study could take away resources or dollars from the clinic and the staff. This misconception and our failure to engage the line staff had a significant impact on the study, and it resulted in an unnecessary delay in our recruitment and certainly strained relations with staff until we were able to identify the problem. So a process like this would have been very helpful. The likelihood of this event happening again or something similar happening in regards to misconceptions is significant, and I would rate that out of 4. And likelihood of impact of the event can be quite significant as well. So I rated both as 4s, which would be a major risk and something that would require a contingency plan.
Okay, great. I'm going to talk briefly about miscommunication. CTN 27, which I'm also involved with, is a lab-based study. We have a central lab for the study, and in doing that, we rely on the central lab to be available for us and turn around our supplies, our lab tests in a very timely manner. Specifically, we have some inclusionary lab tests which are essential to randomizing our participants, their inclusion-exclusion criteria. We had a circumstance with the central lab where they had mechanical failure, and both their machines that ran a certain test were down at the same time. We knew that the lab had contingency plans, but we hadn't had the conversation about what those contingency plans were. So the outcome here was we couldn't randomize our participants. And if you're familiar with CTN 27, the issue is participants must come in withdrawal to randomize the study. And if you can't randomize them when they're in withdrawal, you're most likely going to lose them. So the impact here, I would actually rate as a 5. We couldn't randomize participants into our study. And unfortunately, the likelihood in such a long trial of there being some sort of mechanical error is probably pretty high. I'd rate that as a 4. Now, the interesting part of this story is when we found out what the contingency plan for Quintiles, which is the central lab in CTN 27 based in Georgia, their contingency plan for mechanical failure was to use their sister lab, which is fine, except that sister lab is located in Scotland. As you can imagine, that didn't work for us from a time perspective. It would take way too much time to get our labs back, to get them to Scotland, and results back to us. Ultimately, the situation worked out okay. They were able to fix the machines in just a couple of days. But had this been a prolonged mechanical error, we would have been in a really bad situation. And really, if we had been able to talk through their entire contingency plan before the trial, we would have been in much better shape. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, is just trying to be proactive instead of reactive. At this time, we're going to go ahead and move forward and present the rest of our tools. I'm going to give a very generic scenario I hope everybody can relate to. The situation is driving to work in the rain. The risky event here is that I'm stuck in traffic. The outcome of that is that I miss a client meeting. For me, that would have a major impact, and unfortunately, I don't know how many people are familiar with the D.C. area weather lately, but it's been raining every day. So the likelihood is probably even higher than a 4. It's probably a 17 at this point, but I'm going to go ahead and mark it at 4 for right now. Forward to the next slide is our next tool. This is the risk severity matrix. As you can see, likelihood is represented on the left-hand side in a scale of 1 to 5. Impact is represented on the bottom also as a scale of 1 to 5. So a 4 in each is represented by the star there and falls into a major risk category. Something that falls into a major risk category, certainly we want to have some sort of contingency plan for. And if we move forward to the next slide, you'll see that what we have is the risk response matrix. So the first thing is the risky event. Again, as we talked about, it's stuck in traffic. The response to the risk, there's multiple options here. We can try and reduce the risk. We can try and share the risk. We can try and transfer the risk to others. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that with all the risks? We could try and accept the risk and just try and have contingency plans that mitigate the risk, because really reducing it probably isn't an option. In this circumstance, the contingency plan will be I'll leave 30 minutes early. Now, what's my trigger for my contingency plan? In this circumstance, it would be a weather report. So I watch the weather. I know that for the 100th day in a row in the D.C. area, it's going to rain. And the person responsible is me. I'm responsible to watch the weather report and to leave 30 minutes early. And I really wish I was doing this more, because then I would be getting to work when I expect to get to work and not a little later than I expect. But this is a very basic example of how you can use this in everyday life and how these tools are very sort of simple and straightforward, but really can make a big impact on things. Charlotte, do you mind sharing an example of a clinical event with us?
No, not at all. In fact, let's introduce the first case study and try to apply the process as we go through it. I'm going to read this brief case study, and you also have it on your screen. Jane, a new RA, is conducting all scheduled study visits, but is often unable to complete and enter CRF within the required time frame. It is becoming increasingly difficult to remember visit specifics, and she is concerned about the quality of the data. What's the risk of that? And as we have noted here, the event itself would be the lag in CRF completion. And the outcome of that event was that we missed data and there were increased data queries. In regards to impact, as the data workload mounts and the specifics of the interview, various interviews become increasingly fuzzy, there is a concern for the quality of the data. So I rated the impact on the study as a 4, and the likelihood of this happening, which we all know is a common problem at our site, also out of 4. And that would be then a major risk. And again, I would need to develop a contingency plan. If we go to the matrix and we can plot this out, you see that likelihood is 4, impact is 4, and therefore we've determined a major risk. So let's look at our risk response. In this situation, I chose to try to reduce the risk of this occurring again, meaning the event, which was the lag in the completion of study data. So as a contingency plan, we decided to train all of the research staff on time management, and to cross-train at least one other person at the site to provide some backup when we had a large number of interviews or it was difficult to get all of the data entered. The person responsible, of course, would be me as project manager, because the manager's role is to facilitate a culture of collaboration. And clearly, Jane did not say anything for a while as the data piled up. So we want to create an environment where our staff can say, it's okay. You know, we can say to our staff, it's okay, when they say, I'm sorry, I didn't enter all of the data. Too often, we operate in fear of disclosure, which is perhaps one of the biggest risks of all to the study. We need to acknowledge the likelihood up front that this issue happens on every trial, and it is okay. We just need to plan for it. We can maximize our efforts to reduce the likelihood by becoming aware of the problem through identification, through assessing the degree of risk and the impact on the study, and through monitoring whatever plans we come up with to be sure that it's working and that things haven't changed, which would then lead us to change our contingency plan.
I think a good time point to look at this sort of thing is after a protocol is approved and finalized, and as the protocol-wide manual operations is put together, and prior to, like you said, local SOPs being written. So I think that's a good time point. It's after the protocol is approved and after the MOP is complete or generally complete, it's a really good time to do this.
One of the things that we typically try to do is about 6 months after starting to use the instruments and to do the protocol, we step back and take a look at our procedures, our preliminary procedures, and just see what we need to change or tweak, what worked, what didn't. And I never really thought about it as this process. But in essence, this would be a wonderful structured way to go through that and really determine what we need to do next.
And that was sort of our premise, is that we think a lot of people are already operating along these lines in a lot of different ways. We were just trying to formalize the process a little bit and trying to give some simple tools that sort of encapsulate the process. And that's one of the best things to bring forward about doing this, is that when you're doing the risk analysis for an old trial, for a new trial, bringing those lessons learned is a real value. And it's probably not going to repeat in that trial. Give you a sort of a perspective on what could happen and the unusual events and the circumstances that can occur. But again, it's much easier and much more efficient if it's planned up front.
One of my colleagues brought up a point here that it might be good to consider a backup for each of the vendor and staff functions, particularly critical functions like phlebotomy, and also equipment and equipment breakdowns, because those leave us really vulnerable. So maybe one thing to think about in doing this kind of analysis is those particular events that, as we said with the plan, that are critical to implementing the study.
And if we do this in a formalized way and are able to present our contingency plans to the sponsor, I think we have a much better chance of them funding that sort of plan. Whereas if we just say, well, we're worried about this, but if we've actually gone through the mechanics of doing this whole process and can show this is why we're worried, this is what happened in the past, this is the way it sort of came out on our risk severity matrix, that may increase the likelihood that a sponsor will be willing to pay for that and see the value in investing in money in that contingency plan.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about this, all of a sudden, we as a group started brainstorming. That's fabulous. That's what we're looking for. That's what the premise here is we start brainstorming about these problems. There's enough capability in this group and in all the groups in the CTN trial to really be ahead of these things and be proactive and be able to plan for and mitigate most of these circumstances, and that's kind of what we're seeing here.
All right, to summarize today's event, the process of brainstorming, logging events, rating them, and responding and planning to each event. These are the primary components of risk management, and implementing this process will minimize various surprises, costs, delays, stress, and misunderstandings that could occur. It's important to do this pre-study and post-study to gather a body of knowledge about probable risk that could happen. The mere act of communicating with all stakeholders enables an identification and a realization of vulnerable operations that need to be identified and dealt with accordingly. We included as a resource in the handout a document that was written by the Michigan State University School of Justice. This is a very comprehensive guide to risk assessment matrix. It's a little more complex than the model that we have presented today, but it is very thorough, and I do recommend its review. Recently, I created a bulletin board on LiveLink, and I'd like to invite the audience to access the bulletin board on LiveLink. It's in the CCC section under training. And you can pose any questions you might have about this, concepts for debate, or anything that you'd like to share with fellow CTN colleagues. The training and the presentation handouts will also be available on LiveLink under CTN CCC training. And following this event, I will distribute discussion board access information, a way to enable a email notification when something new has been posted, and I will also distribute a seminar evaluation survey to allow you the opportunity to present us with some seminar feedback, which we always love to get. So at this time, I'd like to thank Charlotte and Jack for presenting for us today, and thank everybody for registering and joining with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. I want to give a special thanks to Liz as well for putting the presentation together and guiding Charlotte and I through this process. She did a great job, and I think that she helped us present a useful training. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz.
You're quite welcome. Bye, everybody.
Bye.